was actually at this event in 2004, and I spoke on climate change and climate in general. It was a quarter of the size. And so it's kind of cool to come back 7 years later and see how it's grown to quite the event. I will tell you, somehow I stumbled into the official River District uniform. This was not planned, not on purpose, but I really do like that logo. And at some point, maybe I can get a shirt from Eric. One more opening remark is that I'm actually your third choice lunch speaker, which seems fine. Because for one, it sets a really low bar, and two, I'm the youngest of three brothers. It seems appropriate that at lunch I deal with this first. This is an actual book that I got in South Australia. It's from Kangaroo Island, which is full of wildlife. And you quickly learn not to drive there at night. And there's 4 different rules about roadkill. One, freshness is always the rule, but it's still on the road on the way home is way better. Semi-squashed is much better than squashed. And sealed roads are a whole lot better than dirt. And you could be having gypsy-style echidna, which is really porcupine, baked in clay, barbecued tiger snake, roasted koala bear, and koalas on Kangaroo Island are not endangered at all, or even kangaroo stew, but yes, you have your lunch today. So anyway, it seemed appropriate to start with that. And let me just skip back and show you this image here. That upper image is a hydrograph of the Murray-Darling system. The green line is the normal hydrograph, and that black line was in 2006, 2007. And boy, if that's an EKG, you have a dead patient, right? That's unprecedented reductions in runoff. And then the lower image, the little sinusoid up above, is normal storage over 7 years, what it should have been. And then that descending line there is what really happened. They got down to very, very low storage before that dropped. So, unbelievable continent, Australia. And that's a huge dust storm there near Broken Hill that occurred in 2009. 2,000-mile-long front of dust appeared during that storm. Probably unprecedented, but we don't know because the prior events were before the satellite age. That lower image is from Toowoomba, and maybe some of you saw the footage on that. That's when that drought ended. And unbelievable floods occurred on that continent. The image on the right side, I've actually seen in U.S. slideshows and been led to believe that it was a Dust Bowl image from this continent, and it's not. In fact, it's an image from Victoria, the state of Victoria, in their 1930s drought, 1931. These two folks celebrating rain. Australia is the driest inhabited continent, and inhabited is important because Antarctica is actually the driest continent. And these images show at the top of the box the annual precip, and then the filled portion, the black portion of that box is what actually runs off. And only 12% of what falls on Australia runs off. And then the size of that black area is actually proportional to the total runoff of the continent. And you can just see how Australia stands out as being a very bizarre place. And Tim Flannery likes to point out that this is the one continent that does not march to the beat of the 4 seasons. It's the continent that marches to the beat of El Nino. And life there is extremely adapted to this very irregular pattern. And the most recent drought, in fact, had an El Nino-La Nina connection. So there's a long history between the U.S. and Australia that's kind of fun to talk about. In 1776, we kicked the Brits out. And few people know that the Brits actually were shipping prisoners here. In fact, you might be sitting next to a descendant of a prisoner, potentially. And when that avenue for dealing with their unwanted folks ended, they started looking around the world to other places. And so in 1788, 12 years and 12,000 miles later, the first fleet with 12 ships and about 1,500 people landed in Sydney. You see the South Australian colony, which is really a nation, an independent nation, was established in 1836, and that's where I was for 4 months in Adelaide. Victoria in 1851. And then here's some interesting irrigation history. Alfred Deakin was actually the second prime minister in Australia after Federation in 1902. But prior to that, he was an important citizen in Victoria, in the state of Victoria. He traveled to the western United States to look at our irrigation practices because he saw similar climatic tendencies, and he really wanted to avoid a riparian doctrine. He wanted to figure out how to do irrigation right in Australia. So he came to the U.S., he came here, went all around the West. He went back in 1886 and was instrumental in passing the Irrigation Act in Victoria. And there's Deacon there on the left. When he was in the United States, he met two brothers, two Canadian brothers, the Chaffee brothers, who were known here for establishing irrigation, quote, schemes. The Australian term is scheme. William and George. How many of you have been to Ontario, California, in the LA Basin? Hands. There's an airport there, right? Any guesses why Ontario is called Ontario? Because that's where the Chafees actually established one of their schemes. The Canadians got to name it, and so they named it after where they come from. Deacon, after he went back to Victoria in 1886, enticed the Chafees to come down, and they founded two very large irrigation projects, one in Victoria and one in South Australia. George Chaffee then returned to the United States and was the engineer in charge of the Imperial Irrigation District and its initial attempts at building canals. In about 1910, the Victorians enticed a little-known state engineer named Elwood Mead to come down and actually run their state water program. And Mead was there for about 4 or 5 years, and then came back and became Commissioner of Reclamation here and oversaw the construction of what's the largest reservoir in the United States, and now bears his name. And so there's this fun history between these two continents that deals with water and prisoners and similarities in how we think. Here's Deacon's 1885 report, and you can see irrigation along Colorado there is circled. So just some quick conversions for you. A megaliter is roughly an acre foot. A gigaliter thus is 1,000 acre feet. Right now, Australian dollars about a US dollar. A hectare is 2.5 acres, and just some quick temperature measurements for you. And I always like to point out that the US is in a really proud company of Liberia and Burma. God guesses what that entails, those three nations, what we have in common. We're the three nations that have decided that the metric system is beneath us. Hence megaliters and gigaliters and Celsius. So a quick look at the world. You can see Australia's a long ways from us. And what's fun to do is to put Australia in the context of the northern hemisphere and put the United States in the context of the southern hemisphere. A couple things jump out at you. One is that Australia sits much closer to the equator than we do. It's about the same size as the United States. It is a huge place. The other thing that I want you to know is there's a line there that's 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south line. And it cuts through southern Australia and it cuts through our American Southwest. And that line, from a climate change perspective, is a really important line because it's where we think much of the drying in the world will occur. Here's their population growth from 1800 to 2008. Looks a little bit like the U.S. 22 million people in Australia, 1/15 the size of the U.S., and it gives them enormous flexibility in what they can do. It is a country now, because of its location next to India and China, is on the up, if you will. For a long time, that distance was a problem, and now all of a sudden, it's an enormous benefit. Here's growth in their rivers. The Murray-Darling Basin MVP water storage from 1920 to 2000 looks like many developed countries. That blue line is total storage, the other lines are individual states. And their total storage is about 2 times the annual flow in the Murray-Darling, which is pretty darn good when you consider that continent is flat as a pancake. And frequently you look at the reservoirs and you think, these are a joke. I mean, they'll have a 600,000 acre foot reservoir that's 30 feet deep. They really struggle to find good reservoir sites. And it's something we take for granted here. And they've done what they could. 30,000 gigaliters in a continent that's remarkably flat is quite an accomplishment. So there's your 21 or 22 million people. Almost 80% of them sit in these 5 big cities. Where I was in Adelaide, it's 1.5 million. Melbourne's 4.5 million. Sydney 5. Brisbane 2. These are incredibly nice cities to live in. They continually get rated as some of the best places in the world to live. The one thing I will tell you is that my wife and I were really happy to come back, and not so much because of the work I was doing, was fascinating, but this is a terrific place to live. And therein lies a lesson, because lots of other people know about this. And so anybody who thinks that Colorado isn't going to continue to be an attractive place to live in the 21st century is on some other planet. We live in an unbelievable place. You like to fish or raft, you like to mountain climb. Mountains are really important, and after living in flat Adelaide for 4 months, we were ready to come home. It is a very neat continent. I love their cities, they're clean, their government works, but this is a neat place to be. So the continent has this in addition to having that 12% runoff factor, where the precip falls, it's not evenly distributed. I don't know how well, that actually shows pretty well. So on the edges of the continent, they get 40 inches, close to a meter of rain. And in the north, they get a lot over in the Perth area in Western Australia. In the middle, next to nothing. And what's happened in recent years is these areas where rainfall has traditionally occurred, it has not occurred, particularly in their fall season. Irrigated ag, much of it's in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is in that lower left-hand corner there. And like everywhere on the planet right now, ag uses about 80% of water. And it's a huge part of the solution and part of the problem, if you will, as well. So I mentioned the 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south lines, and there you can see. And you can also see the major deserts of the world. And we now think, and we have thought for some period of time, that climate change is going to move those deserts poleward. And there's a whole nice reason for this that George Hadley back in the 1700s described. He bears this thing called Hadley cells. I won't bore you with the details, but you can see Australia, especially that lower right-hand corner there, sits poleward of that existing great desert. And our southwestern desert sits south to us, and these are two areas of concern for future drought. This is a figure from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2007, their report. And basically all those circles show areas where they think it's going to dry. And if you look really carefully, look at the southern hemisphere. There's a line there in South Africa, in South America, through Australia. In the northern hemisphere, you can see through the Mediterranean and through the American Southwest. Again, areas where we think are going to dry out. The Aussie Big Dry, as it's known, happened from 1997 to probably 2009 or 2010. That image in the upper right there is that big dust storm I mentioned, that 3,000 kilometer or 2,000 mile storm, and that's the whole eastern seaboard there in that image. In 2009, they had these enormous destructive fires. 3,500 structures lost. You know, in Boulder, we lost 200 in the 4 Mile Canyon place. 3,500 structures, 173 deaths. And now rethinking how they fight and survive fires because of these unbelievable temperatures, particularly in Victoria. Runoff reductions were enormous, and I would maintain, changes language, it changes government policies, water management on all levels. And could it happen here? You bet. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about what's going on in Texas right now, but if you're not paying attention to the Texas drought, you're missing a really important story, because they are smashing, I mean not just by a little bit, but lots of bits, temperature and precip records over the last year. Single worst drought year in their history. That's the Sydney Harbor Bridge in that dust storm. Here's what 12 years of dry conditions get you. The lowest on record rainfalls, and you can see in the southern part of the country here, right in there, that's Victoria, and that's a part of the Murray-Darling Basin. They think a return period of over 300 years on drought. Just an interesting artifact of that continent. They do not have the ability to generate paleoclimatic records like we do here. And so when Terry Fulp shows you a 1,200-year record coming out of the University of Arizona, you should be pleased that we have that kind of data, because they don't. And there's actually no way to get it because of the native vegetation. Here's a look at the River Murray flows from 1891 to 2010, and on the far right side of that, you can just see how low those numbers are over that 10-year period. Again, off the chart. Is it climate change? I don't think anyone will say, but I think what you can say is what you can also say about Texas, is you take a normal drought and you add extra temperatures onto it and you get unprecedented conditions. And that's what we're going to see in the 21st And it's going to be very hard for anybody to say that's climate change. But if you combine a normal drought and higher temperatures, you get things you have never before seen. Here's what happened to surface water use over 5 years. And the upper line is the total Murray-Darling Basin. Those lower lines are individual states. And you can see this precipitous decline in water use. Interestingly, the value of agricultural production only went down by a few percent. And the academics in Australia will tell you this, they think this happened for 2 reasons. One, water markets, which I'll talk about, and 2, a pretty substantial increase in world commodity prices that will buffer that reduction. But literally just a few percent decline, on the order of 5% over that 10-year period. This is a terminal lake in the Murray-Darling system called Lake Alexandrina. And you can see data going back to 1962 there. It's a little under a meter above sea level on a regular basis. You can see what happened during the drought. It actually went below sea level. And the reason that was allowed to happen was in the 1940s, they built a whole series of dams, or what they call barrages, to keep salt water out of these lower lakes, which they irrigate out of. And the reduction in flow here, or level, created all kinds of problems in that Australia is cursed with what are called acid sulfate soils. And these soils, if they're kept wet, they're fine, and if they dry out, they undergo chemical reactions that look a lot like acid mine drainage reactions. That is, the sulfur combines with oxygen in the air, and if you add a little extra water back in them, you get sulfuric acid. Real problem. They were actually bombing this lake with limestone, believe it or not, to try and keep the acidity at a level that wasn't harmful to even human health. The Australians started this water reform back in 1994, and it really came out of an economic impetus. This wasn't environmental, although there was a 2,000-kilometer algal balloon on the Darling system in 1990 that woke everyone up. 2,000 kilometers. 1,500-mile algal. In 1994, the Australians looked at both the U.S., the Reagan Revolution, they looked at what Thatcher had done in the U.K., and decided that their economy needed to be kicked. And they saw many inefficiencies in all of their utilities, including transportation, electricity, and water. And so this entity called the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, which is the equivalent perhaps of the National Governors Association, plus you have the President of the U.S. the Prime Minister is there. And it's not 50 states plus the President, it's 6 states plus the Prime Minister. And when COAG decides to do things, by gosh, things really do get done. And so they set in forth a whole series of reforms, mandatory water planning, water rights simplification, water markets, interstate water markets. They consolidated urban water providers. In the case of many urban areas, they set up an independent price setter. And I'll mention that, Mark Scalacci's remarks earlier today, if you really want to get water utilities to go after conservation, you have got to break the link between the per unit pricing of water that they do right now and how they sell water, because that's not how their costs are, right? They pay enormous infrastructure costs. It has nothing to do with the amount of water they sell. And this is something we've decided to do in our electric utility right now, right, with decoupling. And if you want to go down that path, that's what they have done with some great success. Every major city has a large desal plant right now, $14 billion spent on desal in the last 10 years. They're very proud of their 155 liters per person per day that they got to in many of their cities. And I used to tell them, hey, we do 155 liters, but we do gallons. So that's 40 gallons a person per day during the height of this drought. They did a sustainable yield study that's much like what Terry Folk was talking about today, a basin study. Only instead of $2 million, they spent $15 million. And I've been telling Terry now for over a year, $2 million. I mean, this is like penny ante for a really big problem. We have got to get reclamation more money to do this right, and there's going to be follow-ons. Lots more. That's the Murray-Darling there in the lower right. Here's some other things that have gone on. Interstate water trading in 1998. Huge salinity problems, which I'm not going to talk about. Living Murray environmental process in 2002. Another national Water Initiative, a 500-page Federal Water Act in 2007 that turned over power from the states, constitutional power actually. In their federal constitution, the states turned over power to the federal government to actually help manage the wind farm because they saw they weren't getting the job done in the states. Unprecedented, and if you ask them if they thought it would ever happen, they will tell you no. And this year, a bunch of controversy and some delays in their water reform, but it's going to happen. They're going to pass this bill out of Parliament in 2012 on the So there's the Murray-Darling. It's in 4 states. It's half again the size of the Colorado River, approximately the same annual flow as the Colorado River, more or less, within 20%. And the continent, it's so dry, it has one major river. This is it. Has no, I mean, there are lots of little rivers that aren't so little, but maybe have a 100-mile length to them. This river is 2,500 kilometers, so roughly the length of the Colorado River. It's incredibly glossy because the continent's so flat. And the Darling is that little stem that goes out to the north, if you will, kind of like the Gila, actually. Even though it gets prominence in the name, it's a really fairly small tributary. Most of the water actually comes down to the Murray itself. 30,000 wetlands in this system because it's so flat. And the Australians take their international treaty obligations very seriously. 16 of them are what are called international listed land zones. In 1915, the system was originally allocated like our 1922 compact. And I'll note that Murray, the River Murray there in the south, it's actually the dividing line between Victoria and New South Wales. And originally, when the Queen split Victoria off, she gave New South Wales, the original state, the dividing line was actually the south bank of the Murray River, which has caused all kinds of problems historically, including New South Wales claiming that they owned the whole thing for a period of time, which obviously did not go down too well in the state of Victoria. National Geographic, many folks have covered this. This is from April 2009. Here's just a look at all those wetlands in blue and these terrific birds. If you like birds, Australia, the bird life in Australia is phenomenal. And these birds fly, in many cases, thousands of miles to China, to Korea, to Japan. There are international treaties that cover these birds. They're really quite stunning. Some of these birds, there's a whole category of birds that are called colonial nesting water birds, which I'd never heard of. And they actually require these big floods in the Murray-Darling to go nest. Otherwise, they won't nest. They're at too much risk. And there's a whole series of these very beautiful big birds that the Australians are working with. The northern basin really does different kinds of ag. It does lots of cotton. The southern basin there, which is the Murray, so the northern would be the Darling, and the southern would be the Murray. That big brown bar is dairy, lots of dairy. The green is perennial horticulture, including lots of grapes. And you bet I enjoyed the wine down there. There is unbelievable wine. You have a bunch of truck crops, and the red is rice. And what happened during this drought is the cotton went away, the rice went away, because they're both very low-value producers relative to the amount of water they used. And that big black brown bar, the dairy folks, they sold their water. And they bought grain in the classic economic substitution, and they did just fine by selling their water and buying grain for their dairy herds. Again, the typical irrigated ag on that upper left graph, you can see is roughly 80% of Murray-Darling Basin use. The environmental needs in that system, because it's so flat, because you need these big floods on a regular basis, are enormous relative to what we think of in terms of environmental needs. You can see that in the lower right-hand edge of that section. The Murray is plumbed just like the Colorado. Those, you can see lakes, you can see on the lower left, those are all the locks dating back to the 1920s when they wanted to, the South Australians thought commerce, riverboat commerce, was the future of the river prior to the railroads actually. And there's still steamers on the Murray itself. You can look at the Murray as it extends out to the right. Because it's so flat, actually you can send water multiple ways, and you can see that sort of in the middle of the diagram here. And then I'll mention that whole section on the right is what's called the Snowy Scheme, and it was a 25-year project. It's their equivalent of our Hoover Dam. Lots of national pride. Unlike Hoover Dam, you would probably never build that thing today because of the environmental impacts. 1% of the original flow remains in the Snowy River right now. And they put 1 million acre-feet out of the Snowy into the Murray. And hence you might figure out that trying to solve both those problems right now is an issue. Okay. Australians are very good. I think they're far better than we are at looking at environmental health. They've had these major audits, and they don't just focus on threatened and endangered species. They look at all kinds of things like nutrients and temperature of macroinvertebrates, and they come up with measures of environmental health that I think are far better than ours. This one survey that they did in 2004 or 2007 showed that something like 3 out of their 20 different tributaries in the Murray-Darling were okay, and the rest are poor or buried. Billabongs are, I kidded Doug Kemper that this was not the pipe he smoked in college, Colorado Water Congress. They're actually oxbows, and you can see one in that black and white photograph there in the middle. And they fill up every year or every couple of years and provide environmental benefits that are really important for the system. And there you can see the Murray Mouth, which was closed over the last 10 years. In normal times, it should be closed 1% of the time. We now think it's closed about 40%. Hence all their efforts to try and do things. Here's a Murray cod, one of the world's largest freshwater fish. And those numbers have declined precipitously since the 1960s, and introduced species like European carp have gone crazy. Here's the Snowy, and you can see the Snowy itself there in that image. That's what 1% of normal flow looks like. And they're trying to get it to 22% without damaging the water, without damaging the environmental issues in the Murray, because you're going to have to take water out of the Murray to put it back in the snow. Here's the National Water Initiative. And states have got to prepare water plans. They're going to deal with every over-allocated system. They're going to have registers of water rights and standards. They're going to expand the trade in water. They're working towards full-cost pricing on water storage and delivery. They've got a brand new water commission, which is a national body. And almost everything they've done flows out of this very important agreement that comes out of their council, Australian government. Tremendous publications actually out of the National Water Commission, and I like the reform-mindedness of the Australians. So I will tell you, I think, in some sense, because that economy is so small, they really do need to pay attention, because it's very easy to get a captive audience. And what we found when we were down there is prices occasionally would be just through the roof, unbelievably expensive, because they did not have the competition in a nation of 300 million like ours has. And in essence, I think they pay a little bit more attention to reform. And so the National Water Commission is an attempt to really look at everything that's going on and produce these reports that say, okay, states, you're doing good or you're doing bad. This is that 500-page bill that came out of the Commonwealth in 2007. It actually came out of the conservative government. And that's how deeply this issue touched the national psyche. It actually was proposed out of the conservative government and then picked up later when the Liberals, or when Labor won in 2008. And they created a whole new Murray-Darling Basin Authority. They're going to create a legislative document that's going to deal with what are called sustainable diversion limits. There's all kinds of things that flow out of this really important document. This is the CIRO, or effectively their research body. This is their sustainable yield study. This is their basin study for Florida. And they did it in about 18 months, 15 million people. They did climate change, they did historical flows. They looked at flow out of the mouth of the Murray, which is critical for moving salt through the system. They looked at all kinds of issues, and it has guided their actions throughout this sustainable diversion limit process. You can see that drought in the southern part of the Murray-Darling Basin on the upper right. These are some projections that came out of that study. And
Like here, you get a range of projections from increases to decreases, but the median, you can see the blue or aqua line there is below zero, meaning the median shows declines. And again, the reason is they sit at that 30% or 30-degree latitude point. This is a $13 billion plan that was announced in 2009, and if you did it per capita in the U.S., it'd be $200 billion. And they're going to spend $2 billion modernizing Victoria's ag infrastructure. Victoria is very committed to maintaining their agriculture, and I was sitting actually with some Rubicon folks here. And they have a big part of this, actually. We visited Rubicon's factory in 2009 in Shepperton on the first trip there. They're spending $3 billion on actually buying back water from the environment to reduce the over-allocation. Penny Wong was the Minister for Climate Change and Water. What an unusual title. In the U.S., you never have that title. Water markets. So this image shows the growth in water markets from 06, 07 to 08, 09, and 09 to 10. $3 billion was traded last year in water. And what's interesting is that yellow bar there, that's New South Wales. And those other bars, the blue bars, are two other states. New South Wales has actually been losing water in this deal, and it's been coming out of their rice farm, which again is not a great way, if you're an economist, it's not a great way to spend your water money, your effective water money. This trade is, you can now do these trades in a matter of days, either your permanent allocation or your annual allocation. You can trade those in just, and you can do kind of like you trade stocks, actually. You can go on websites to do it. It's quite impressive what they do. There's some water prices between a dry year and a wet year. $400 a megaliter, roughly acre foot in the wet year, in the dry year, and about $150 in the wet. If you look at the far left image there, you look at how those prices are so different, what's going on there, that system's not connected to the rest. So you can't actually move water out of that system. And so the water's sort of less value. This was released in 2010. It's their plan, and was not met with great approval. You can see it being burned there, and it slowed down the process. But they're going to end up implementing something that looks like about 30% clawbacks in water through water purchases by the federal government. One of the things they looked at was end of system health, and you can see on the left-hand side here the current, all those red being poor, and what they plan to do if they bought 3,000 gigaliters, or roughly 3 million acre feet, 3.5 million acre feet, or 4 million acre feet, how the improvement occurs. Here's the look at with and without development flows. On the left, the Murray Mouth used to get a huge amount of water, and recently it hasn't. You can see where environmental uses and diversions, and even what they call farm dams, where the water all goes. Many studies on how things work and don't work. Here's the Murray Mouth. What it should be without development, that little tiny 1% closed slice on the upper left. That second bar is the 40% closed it is now, and what they think it might look like in the future if they actually buy back water. Here's a look at what they really think happens to irrigated ag. About 10% loss of production at 3 million acre foot clawback. So not nearly as much as you might think given the amount of water that they think they get. And markets are in large part the reason for that. So what are all the lessons here? One, this kind of crisis, it allows the unthinkable, but you really got to be prepared for it. Markets minimize the economic cost. And you know, we've seen at least a little bit of that here. Intentionally created surpluses and attempt really to try and move water around in ways. We still can't do it the way the Australians do, but we're making some progress. They have a shared system of water allocation, unlike ours. So there's a great incentive for the whole group of people to use water, not to let more people into that system, right? Because every additional person you put into it means you get less. And it's a little bit like perhaps what the Front Range is now facing with regard to future Colorado River development. Every additional diversion puts them at additional risk for compactor count. You know, they have these correct water right priorities, at least by what I think a 21st century society should have. critical human needs first, environment second, and agriculture third. You can fight over what those numbers are, but that's what they truly believe. They have independent oversight. They're living within their limits. They're deciding, okay, we're going to have to claw back some water. The desal they're doing is important, but it's a really tiny picture volumetrically and will never be economical for farming. They fund their science at a level that I think is valuable, as opposed to the kind of money that would give them Terry, which is just not right. I said this before, this is an incredible place to live, and we're going to see more growth here. I don't think there's any two ways about it. I had a great time living down there. Even the Crummy Front Range is a great place to live. I've lived on the West Slope. I love it out here. But being on the Crummy Front Range is terrific. The Australians look at the environment in a really integrated fashion. They don't just focus on endangered species. They look at the whole ecosystem health. Climate change is a superimposed on normal drought is a big problem. I said that. And you can see the U.S. drought monitor there. There's Texas. That's all D4, the worst form of drought, single worst drought in their history. And this image on the right is summer precipitation versus summer temperature. You see that red dot up there? That's 2011. All those other little dots, those are all other years in the record. Look at that just for a second, how different that is. And finally, climate change is not just drought, it's also floods. We're going to see more of the extremes. And by gosh, they've seen those too. You will make the same foolish mistakes you have made before, not only once, but many, many times. Thanks.
Island nation. To what extent is agricultural independence and food security part of this national debate in the trade-off regarding irrigated agriculture and water in municipalities and environment?
Now, they export a tremendous amount of food, but maintaining a healthy agricultural system is important to them, just like it's important to us. There are 2 million people in the Murray-Darling Basin, so 1/10 of the national population sits there, which is actually pretty large if you think about it relative to our agricultural areas. In some cases, I think, have 1% of the population. They value that. They value the lifestyle. It's a part of that debate. And so I think they're trying to do the balance between what's right for the environment, what's right for the people, and what's right for the nation as a whole.
One more.
Brad, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the comments you made about water marketing in Australia. And in particular, my understanding is that in Australia you can transfer the whole diversion amount. There's no reduction for the amount that goes back into the stream, which under our system just could never happen. But that obviously cuts down dramatically on transaction costs. If you can do a trade in a day or two, then there can't be any transaction costs associated with that. And obviously couldn't adopt that system directly here, but could you expand a little bit more on what lessons might be learned?
Well, the system in some ways looks a lot like Colorado Big Thompson, right, where people have shares and you can move stuff around without having to quantify return flows. And I'm still trying to get my handle around the return flow issue. In a lot of cases, they don't want return flows. They don't want excess application of water on land because of the salinity problems that they have. There's a saying in Australia, if it moves, shoot it, and if it stands, cut it down. And what they have done effectively is cut every living thing down on that continent to grow stuff where they could grow. The land use change there, it's unbelievable, and you don't know it until somebody starts talking to you about it. And the problem is, once they cut down everything, they then have these local water tables rise, and frequently those tables were saline. And so they do not want over-application of water, because it just brings that water table up closer to the surface. And they're literally spending hundreds of millions of dollars on various salt interception schemes. And one of the things I didn't mention is that one of the reasons the Murray Mouth is so important, getting flow out of there, is moving salt out of that system. They do not want it building up. And so it's kind of a long-winded response to your question, but the return flow issue is very different than here. There's a bunch of different factors associated with it.
Seven hands for our third choice.